Hello and welcome to Soothing Pod's Sleep Stories. My name is Chris, and tonight I will be your guide as we embark on a journey unlike any other. Tonight, under the light of the silvery moon, we will travel to the sleepy town of Cypress Cove. Tucked away at the end of a craggy cobblestone path on the coast of New England. A town just as shrouded in fog as it is in mystery, with a creature that some believe sprung from the earth thousands and thousands of years ago and has remained, causing troubles and spreading curiosity for the locals for years and years. Before we begin our journey to Cypress Cove, however, let us take a moment to unwind and find peace and comfort in the place that we're in, here and now. Close your eyes and allow your body to sink into the mattress beneath you. Here and now, there is no to-do list. There are no responsibilities or obligations. You are free to lie in bed, your eyes closed, and simply listen to the sound of my voice. By closing your eyes, lying on your mattress, and joining me on this journey, you are already giving your body the rest it deserves. And though it may not feel like it yet, know that both your body and mind are beginning to relax and rest, here and now. For a moment, let us imagine that we are in a picturesque place, somewhere by the coast. You find yourself in a safe spot on a tall cliff that overlooks a cove down below. This is no Cypress Cove, not yet. But as you gaze down at it, it is undeniable that the view is simply breathtaking. The cove is completely untouched by civilization. From this safe and comfortable spot on the rocky cliff, you can see everything. The cove curves into a brilliant half-moon shape, so perfectly arched that it looks as if the heavens reached down with a paintbrush and painted the coast into a smile. The sand that kisses the waves is a soft beige color, warm and natural, like the wood buried beneath the bark of the tree you are leaning up against. But the sand is a living display of color. Every time a wave comes up, the beige sand is painted a darker and darker shade. You can see it progressing as high tide comes to be. As the water makes its way back onto shore, where it feels it belongs, at least for now, the water itself is a mosaic of majestic colors. Calm cerulean, a tranquil turquoise, a peaceful pale periwinkle. They all meld and dance against one another, creating entirely unique shades that bring your whole body a sense of relaxation as you gaze down at them in awe. The waves rise onto the shore in slow, steady unison, they slowly reach over the sand. And then there's a moment of peace, of hesitation. They seem to freeze in place as they crest, reaching their highest point on the sand before they ever so slowly retreat, leaving a frothy white foam behind. Even from where you are sitting, you can see the effervescent bubbles of the foam pop and simmer on the cool, damp sand, sparkling and glistening as they disappear altogether. And then you notice something that may be even more beautiful than the waves lapping the shore and the cool blue ocean whirling and glistening below. There is fog descending into the cove, blanketing it softly, like a mother tending to a child who has fallen asleep on a cool autumn night. The fog brushes over the waves as it makes its way to shore, where it wraps its misty tendrils around trees, boulders, wild flowers, and sleeping fawns alike. Everything is engulfed in this sleepy mist. Everything is given permission to simply relax and unwind, to let go of any expectations they may have for themselves, or any pressure they are putting on themselves, as you take a breath, drinking in the air the tastes of the ocean and pine trees and frosted mountains. You notice that the fog is growing thicker. Soon, it is like you are standing in a cloud, like the whole cove is ascending up to the heavens. But then, when you breathe out, the fog becomes less thick and more transparent. You can see the curve of the ocean, the mountains of rocks, and the valleys of trees. You breathe in, watching as the fog grows more and more thick, until everything is completely serene. Then you breathe out, watching as clarity returns to the land, and the beauty of it is revealed. You breathe in, watching and feeling as the fog grows and grows. And you breathe out, feeling the clarity of the land and the world around you return. Now that we have taken a moment to relax and find comfort in the place that we are in here and now, let us begin our story and our journey to the sleepy coastal town of Cypress Cove, where a mystery unlike any other awaits us. It was the very end of summer when Josephine found herself in a bright yellow cab, bumping and wobbling down the quaint cobblestone streets that allegedly led to Cypress Cove. It was a town she had never heard of before last week, a town that you would never see on any maps or any road signs. And by the look of the road she was on in the cab, she realized it was probably for good reason. The craggy cobblestone road, laced through a forest so thick you could hardly see anything in it at all. The only things that Josephine could make out were streams of sunlight that managed to weave their way through the thick canopy above and shine on the forest floor, illuminating the plush moss growing there. The beams of sunlight glowed and glistened in an otherworldly, ethereal way, sparkling like bits of stardust were flowing in the air. But there was something ominous about the darkness around it. Felt much like what she had heard of the place. A town with pockets of light. The beautiful coastal location. The remoteness. The kindness of the people. The compassion of the community. The quality of all the locally grown and sourced food. But then, there was darkness around it. The mystery that had been plaguing this town for what seemed to be years. That mystery was precisely why Josephine wanted to visit Cypress Cove. She had to know the truth behind it. And there was a big part of her that felt she may be able to solve the mystery. And she was off to a fairly good start. Because as the cab wound down those brilliant country roads that somehow felt like they were leading to nowhere and everywhere all at once, the cab driver looked in the rearview mirror at Josephine with a sparkle in his old, kind eyes. "Have you heard the tale of the creature?" he asked, raising his brow as his voice rose with the curious question. He nibbled on the edge of a toothpick, like a grizzled sea captain with stories to tell. Of course, Josephine had heard of the creature, so she nodded. "Have you ever seen it?" she asked. As soon as the question left her lips, she saw a glint in the cab driver's eyes that made her lean forward in anticipation. I've seen the beast with my own 2 eyes, the cab driver replied. A beast about the size of a dog, but twice as strange and 3 times as ugly. It stalks through the town on foggy nights when the moon is at its peak. But when I saw it, it wasn't in town. It was in my own home. A tiny shiver danced its way down Josephine's spine. She leaned forward even more, her voice simmering with desire to know more. "It was in your house. What did it do? What did you do?" The cab driver chuckled at that and replied, "I did what we all do. I yelled until it ran out of the house. I caught it on my counter of all places, making a mess of things like it does. There was flour on the floor, spilled milk, napkins, and knickknacks galore. It's as if the beast enjoyed making a mess of things." "What did it look like?" Josephine asked. The cab driver shuddered. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen. It was so dark, it was just a blur. But I swear it had more than one head and more than one tail. I've never seen anything quite like it. But not to worry, miss. I'm sure you won't have any run-ins with the creature while you're staying here in our beautiful town. The cab driver motioned ostentatiously to the view before them, just as they came out on the other side of a set of breathtaking weeping willow trees. The tendrils of the willow tree moved aside like a curtain, revealing the town of Cypress Cove. It was almost exactly what Josephine imagined the sleepy coastal New England town would look like. A handful of streets lay before her, all paved with cobblestones and lined with lush perennials and beautiful burning bushes. Many of the homes were Cape style, and some were cozy cottages with intricately designed porches and large French doors overlooking English gardens. Each home was entirely unique. Homes that had surely been lovingly passed down from generation to generation. You could practically feel the energy radiating from the houses as you looked at them. Years of children laughing in the gardens. Years of parents baking homemade apple pies from the orchards down the road and setting them in the windows to cool down in the soft ocean breeze. Many people waved as the car passed. Whether it was to Josephine or the cab driver, she wasn't quite sure. But regardless, she waved back, and each and every wave was met with a smile. As they pulled up to the taxi stop, the only one in town, Josephine leaned forward, handing the cab driver a tip. "Where could I hear more about the creature?" she asked. The kind old cab driver chuckled to himself, a warm, gentle chuckle of amusement. He pointed down at the docks, which were only a few 100 feet away. "You'll want to talk to Mr. Trin, the fisherman. He seems to have run-ins with the creature more than anyone else." With that, the cab left Josephine in the dust, trailing up and up and up over the valley that the town was nestled in, and disappearing over the distant horizon. Now alone in the strange little town, Josephine was able to take it in more clearly, and it was hard to deny that there was a strange kind of magic in the air. Though it was the middle of the day, one could look at the sky and the town and reasonably say it was dusk. The clouds above were some of the darkest that Josephine had ever seen. They seemed to press down on the town, so close that it felt like you could reach out and brush your fingers through them just overhead. A mist clung to the town, and even though she had only been here for a few moments, Josephine had an inkling that it was always like this. At this time of day, the streetlights were glistening, Old school oil lamps with flames that flickered in the dark air. The flames flickering over the cobblestone streets took the entire town back in time. An element that only added to the magic of this place. The foliage that lined the town was thick and lush. Moss popped up in between cobblestones, lacing through them like a living, thriving maze. Flowers peppered cracks in the stones and lined the edges of them, using the walkway as its own kind of canvas. Josephine began the short walk down the shore. In the distance on the water, a few worn-down sailboats and lobster boats bobbed in the mellow waves. Their paint was chipped, and old, faded names sweetly adorned the sides. The ocean around the boats was nearly as dark as the sky overhead, making it look as if they were floating in an ocean of nothingness. The mist engulfing the boats made some of them appear in the distance like mirages, and the fog engulfing the docks gave the entire vista a chilling edge. Josephine made her way down the docks. The wooden docks appeared to be as old as the town itself. With each and every slow, deliberate step Josephine took, the boats creaked louder and louder, as they surely had for generations. The worn planks of the single dock carried more stories than many other towns combined. At the very end of the dock, a faded blue building popped against the grey of the backdrop. The sign read, in mustard yellow paint, "Fish, lobster, tackle." Lobster pots dotted the dock in front of the building, and old fish nets hung from the sides, waiting to be used any day now, any hour now. Not a single person walked by, and Josephine felt as though she had the whole town to herself. Josephine cracked open the door slowly. The store was a classic fish market, a large counter with fresh fish spread from wall to wall, buoys hanging from the ceiling, and nets hanging from all the walls. Behind the counter, a kind, hard-working man flashed Josephine a smile. "Are you lost, miss?" Mr. Trin asked. Josephine chuckled and told him that she wasn't lost, but she could use some help. She took a seat across from the man on a stool covered in stickers. "What can you tell me about the creature that lives in this town?" Josephine asked, her voice low, smooth, and honey-sweet. Mr. Trin let out a sigh and motioned to his fish. "I'll tell you what I know about the creature that lives in this town. It must eat its weight in my fish every single day." He groaned. He went on to explain to Josephine that nearly every single day, dozens of his fish would go missing. Some would go missing from the boat, but some would go missing straight from the shelves in the store. Mr. Trin had tried his hardest to protect his catch, but it seemed like nothing could deter the strange creature wreaking havoc on his store. He has seen the creature on occasion, always scurrying away in the shadows. When Josephine asked him what the creature looked like, Mr. Trin confidently told her that it was about the size of a dog, but that it had 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 heads. Josephine had even more questions about the creature. Clearly, it was intelligent, and clearly it ate fish. To be able to steal pounds and pounds of fish every day, the animal truly had to be something special. Josephine thanked Mr. Trin for his time, then asked him what he thought the creature was. With a smile on his lips and a twinkle in his amber eyes, Mr. Trin told Josephine that he believed the creature had come from the sea. Perhaps it was the monster of the town's ancient legends, a creature that would steal lobsters right out of pots and fish right off of the plates of the townspeople. But if Josephine wanted to know more, Mr. Trin said she could go and visit Mrs. Baker, the librarian down the street. Mrs. Baker would tell her that it wasn't just fish that were going missing. Fueled by this lead and even more questions, Josephine thanked Mr. Trin for his time, but not before Mr. Trin handed Josephine a fillet of fresh salmon to welcome her to the neighborhood. Josephine took the fish with a smile and headed back out into the mist, thankful that someone who was already losing so much business would be willing to give Josephine something so precious to him. When Josephine stepped outside, there was even more of a chill in the air. She curled up in her sweater, folding her arms over her chest for comfort. Against the brisk air, the warmth of her wool sweater felt like a hug. Overhead, a steady drizzle began to rain down, but Josephine didn't mind it much. With this amount of fog, there were already drops of dew hanging to the ends of her ginger locks, and her glasses were already peppered with specks of water and a thin layer of fog. In fact, the rain made Josephine feel more at ease. Breathing in the brilliant aroma of the rain-soaked landscape caused her chest to rise and fall more and more slowly with each step that she took. She felt her lungs opening up more, nourishing her with the sweet, brisk, fresh air. The smell of the damp soil and flowers filled the air and danced through the fog, washing over Josephine in a tranquil wave. By the time she reached the library, she was utterly at ease, in spite of the circumstances that brought her to Cypress Cove. The library was perhaps the most beautiful building in town, made entirely of stone and stained glass. It resembled a church more than a library. A massive staircase laced up the side of a cliff, leading up to the top where the library was perfectly perched. All around the stairs, bright pink and orange roses glistened with dewdrops from the freshly fallen rain. Although she was eager to talk to Mrs. Baker, Josephine couldn't help herself, so she bent down and took a smell of the roses. Their aroma caused her to loosen up even more. She surrendered to its allure, pressing her palms together as she let out a delighted sigh. The roses smelled of pure rose water, bright and earthy and floral and brilliant. She smiled at the flowers and gave them one last smell before she bounded off, heading up the stairs to the library. The library was a thing of magic. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the ocean, and stained glass windows of celestial and serene scenes adorned the front facing the street. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, reaching all the way up to the tall ceiling overhead. The aroma hanging in the air of the library was enough to put Josephine to sleep. It smelled of old books, of bubbling coffee, of warm Earl Grey tea and honey. This was a hideaway she could see herself using fairly often. Mrs. Baker peered out from behind the counter, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses with a delicate hand as she did so. She was an older woman with soft eyes and an even softer aura about her. Josephine introduced herself to Mrs. Baker, who was delighted that Josephine was new to town. When Josephine revealed her reason for coming to town, however, Mrs. Baker's warm smile faded. She told Josephine that she had better catch the no-good creature and rid the town of it forever. Mrs. Baker had lived in Cypress Cove her whole life, but she had never seen anything like this past year. She had had not one, not two, but 3 cats go missing in just the past few months, and there were several townspeople who experienced the same thing. Josephine's stomach sank with worry. She asked Mrs. Baker what she thought the creature was, and if she believed the creature had taken her cats. Mrs. Baker told Josephine she believed the creature was some kind of wolf hybrid, a monster that was unleashed on the town in the past year. Josephine asked Mrs. Baker some details about her cats. The one that went missing first, on Easter, was named Cupcake, and Cupcake was a bit of a mischievous little critter. She had always been playing with things she shouldn't have, bringing home the socks and clothes of neighbors as prey she had caught, and climbing the willow tree in the front yard all hours of the night. Cupcake was a wanderer, So at first, Mrs. Baker wasn't worried. But soon, when she hadn't returned, Mrs. Baker began to fear the worst. She begged Josephine to look out for Cupcake in her search for the creature, and Josephine agreed. Unsure of where to go next, Josephine asked Mrs. Baker if there was anyone else she should speak to that had strange run-ins with the creature. It didn't take Mrs. Baker long to tell Josephine to speak to Mr. Yates, the first-grade teacher in town. Josephine would be able to find him just down the road at the craft fair where he sold pottery. Josephine made her way down to the craft fair. It was a cozy little setup, nestled in front of the only church in town. Booths full of local wares lined the sides of the cobblestone, each one filling the square with the fragrant smell of sweets, homemade candles, and incense. Even the rain didn't stop the craft makers from smiling and joking with one another. Josephine spotted the pottery booth at the edge of the fair. She introduced herself to Mr. Yates, a man in his 30s who gave off energy much, much older than he was. Josephine told Mr. Yates she had come to this town to get to the bottom of the strange creature the locals were whispering about. Mr. Yates told her that he had indeed had a run-in with the creature. On Easter earlier this year, he had been selling wares at this very craft fair when his booth was ransacked by some creature. He came back from getting a snack to discover his booth in complete disarray. But he said something that really piqued Josephine's interest. At the time, he had been selling homemade masks for Easter. Josephine found herself thinking about everything she had learned that day. This town was a town that had forever been shrouded in myths and legends. But it was only this past year that mysterious goings-on had ramped up. The cat, Cupcake, went missing on Easter, the same time that Mr. Yates's masks were stolen. On top of that, the creature had a delight for fish and shoving things off of counters. Josephine asked Mr. Yates if he saw where the creature went. He told her he saw a blur of it as it ran into the far woods. He knew there was an old abandoned store out there, but no one had been out there in years. Confident in her theory, Josephine thanked Mr. Yates and headed off into the forest in the direction he had pointed. He nervously called out to Josephine, urging her to be careful. However, Josephine knew she wouldn't have to be. She descended into the dark, beautiful forest. The fog was even thicker here, and the air smelled of old wood and fresh moss. She made her way down an old forgotten path until she reached a crumbling, abandoned store. And there, nestled beneath the willow tree in the front yard, was a creature just like everyone had described. It was about the size of a dog, with multiple heads and 2, 3, maybe even 4 tails. However, the creature was far from a beast. The creature was Cupcake, with several homemade masks stuck to her, and streamers and other craft supplies hanging from the end of her tail. Cupcake rolled over lazily in the sunshine and purred at Josephine, who knelt down and slowly began to take the masks and supplies off the cat. More cats gathered around, jumping out of the nearby building. It would seem that the cats had all started their own kind of community here. A community that stole fish, snuck into houses, and chased mischief, just as cats young and old do. Josephine suspected poor Cupcake had gotten stuck in Mr. Yates' display, tangled in the supplies, and was so startled that she ran off, too spooked to cross the square and go back to her house on the far side of town. Josephine scooped Cupcake up in her arms. She purred warmly and looked at Josephine with thankful eyes. Josephine had a feeling the town would be thankful too, as long as they could laugh at themselves just a little. That afternoon, Josephine returned Cupcake to Mrs. Baker, who was overjoyed. Cupcake cried with glee and curled up in her mother's arms, delighted to be reunited. That night, Mrs. Baker dragged Josephine to the local pub to tell everyone the truth of the creature. Everyone laughed at how silly they had been. But deep down, many of them weren't ready to let go of the curious creature of Cypress Cove. They say to this day, when the fog descends on the harbour, you can spot a creature with many heads and tails, causing a little bit of mayhem everywhere it goes. I hope you have enjoyed this sleep story, and it has brought you a night of peaceful, relaxing sleep. Remember, just like the curious creature of Cypress Cove, things are rarely as scary as they seem. Please, join me again tomorrow night for another sleep story. Until then, sweet dreams.